trying to get in on YouTube. So I'm Ann Cook. I'm the executive director of the Performance Assessment Consortium. And on your behalf, I want to welcome members of the New York State Board of Regents, those of them who are still on. I hope some of them are. Regent Mittler and Reyes and Tillis and Wills, and the Superintendent Alan Chang and his team, and Deputy Superintendent Laura Evangelista and her team, and Superintendent Paul Rotundo. We also want to welcome New York Civil Liberties Union Executive Director Donna Lieberman, Joanna Miller and their staff, and Professor Michelle Fine, who was the lead researcher on our CUNY, is continued to be the lead researcher on our CUNY pilot study. Also Jan Atwell from the New York City Council's Education Committee, Marty Brooks, who's the executive director of the Tri-State Consortium, and other guests. And last year, we welcomed all of you at the Julia Richmond Complex, never suspecting what would follow 6 weeks later. This event could never have been taken place without all of the staff and the expertise of AJ, who's been struggling with the crash of Zoom and YouTube. I think we're back on, and I hope that most of you are stayed on for this, the webinar, and also for the workshops that follow. You all have the links for the workshops. And I have one critically important shout out. I want to pay tribute, a special tribute really, to the consortium classroom teachers, support staff, and administrators. Really, you've done a remarkable job during COVID-19. From last March on, we've seen staff at our schools take on unimaginable responsibilities. And despite your own personal struggles, you've responded to crisis after crisis with thoughtfulness, compassion, and professionalism. You've been there for the kids, helping young people make sense of an increasingly hard to understand world. You figured out ways to engage and support isolated and all too often grieving students. You delivered personally devices to individual student homes, along with food vouchers and books. You designed new curriculum that responded to unfolding events and coped with the limitations of remote learning. And as consortium teachers and administrators, you've met the challenges of staying connected with your students, meeting them in parks, on Zoom, through texts and on phones. And you invented and collaborated with your colleagues. You replanned, you rethought, and you rejiggered your schedules. And you supported students as they completed PBATs, amazingly enough, and even some oral defenses. And then last June, you created meaningful online graduation ceremonies that made students and families proud. We thank you. And what a year this has been. Probably one of the most difficult any of us have ever faced. And as if COVID wasn't enough of a threat to our physical health, a twice impeached president posed a threat both to our mental stability and the nation's very existence. Our country is threatened by challenges to the rule of law, repeated demonstrations of systemic racism, and a dismal failure of governmental leadership. When you have science deniers threatening citizens queuing for their vaccines at LA Dodger Stadium, more than 200 Republican legislators refusing to acknowledge the 2020 election results, a QAnon member asserting conspiracy theories from the floor of the US House of Representatives, and a growing list of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor atrocities, you know we're in trouble. So the theme of this conference, this year's conference, is examining the role of public education in a democratic society, and it couldn't be more timely. Today's panel should both provide us with thoughtful insights as well as raise questions about how we respond to educational policies and what we do in our classrooms to provide students with experiences and dispositions that will help them become active participants in a democratic society and lifelong change makers. To begin, it is now my honor to introduce Takiema Bunche-Smith, an experienced educator, a consortium parent, and executive director of the Center on Culture, Race, and Equity at Bank Street College, and she will moderate our panel event. An insightful interview with Takiema appears in Jesse Hagopian's book, Black Lives Matter at School. So Takiema, welcome.
Thank you so much, Anne. So as we were mildly and moderately freaking out about the fact that technology did not seem to be on our sides, I had a moment and I said, this is exactly what everybody who's on this feed has been going through since March 2020. So it's probably really good that we get to experience all the challenges that you have had to manage in shifting your work and lives into the virtual space. And then you got a little taste of what it felt like to be on the other side, waiting for 35 minutes for us to get the tech together. So I hope that it's just a reminder for us all to give grace in this moment and to center our humanity, because we are all we have, right? And that's, if anything, 2020 taught us that we must be human centered above all. So I want to start by a statement. We honor and pay respects to the Lenni Lenape people of the past, present, and future, whose ancestral homeland, Lenape-Hoking, our homes and our institutions occupy today. I'm currently speaking to you from the unceded land of the Canarsie and the Lenape. Just want to always remember that and keep interrogating what that means. I want to share one song that I think only 40 people got to hear one version of when we first started, but it was the Woody Guthrie version of This Land. And I'm hoping that we can just listen to this short other version of This Land now for a moment. The volume's not playing, just sorry.
This land is native land, this land is native land, from the Iroquois to Coast Salish Islands, from the Tule River tribe to the Navajo. This land was stolen from my people. This land is stolen land, this land is stolen land, from where our buffalo roamed and where our salmon swam, to attempted genocide and assimilation, colonization, stole more than you know.
So just want to keep reminding us that the work continues. The work is ever more complex. The more we live and the more we learn and the more we begin to unlearn. So today I wanted to just take a few minutes. I'm going to try to shorten my remarks, which, if anyone knows me, is always hard in the best of times, because I generally have a lot to say because I like to listen and learn a lot. But I'm going to share a little bit about my story, which ties in, I think, very well with the theme of today's conference, the role of public education and democratic society. So I graduated from Bank Street College of Education in 1997, and I was like so ready to go out and do progressive education. Like I was like, I'm ready. This is it. This is what I do. This is what I believe. It aligns with my values. And I went to teach first grade in the border between Bed-Stuy and Williamsburg, Brooklyn. In Bed-Stuy, right? I mean, depends on who you talk to. And so these are two students that I had, Ariel and Enrique, in 1997. And I love this photo because it was an example of how I was really trying to bring student-centered learning and to think about their interests, to create experiences that would connect them, right? So that they could be connected to learning and interested in learning. So we had done a study on Black cowboys. They happened to be interested in horses. And so, it kind of naturally evolved. And that day we had visitors from the Black cowboys that were out in the edge of Brooklyn on the border between Brooklyn and Queens. And they came in and brought materials. And as you can see, Ariel was really excited. Enrique was like, this smells like horse. So that was funny. So when I reflect back on teaching in public school, first grade in 1997, if you know anything about policy, this was before No Child Left Behind began. So there was a little bit of flexibility that I remember having in terms of being able to have a block area, to be able to have a dress up area or a dramatic play area. And my students had an hour of outdoor play every single day. If you know anything about what first grade looks like now, it's completely unheard of. It might as well have been like, you know, the 1700s, like it just doesn't exist in that way, which is sad. So even with that little bit of flexibility that I found to try to have a progressive education, I also found that it was very limited, that I was not able to get at the curriculum that I wanted to do, which was to create citizens, right? Students, children, and then eventually citizens that would question things around them that didn't make sense, right? Why are so many folks in our community low income? Why are my parents struggling to make ends meet? Why am I hungry? Why is there police violence? My first year teaching, a brother, older brother of my, one of my first graders was murdered by the police when he went to the grocery store on Christmas Day. I will never forget. That still has a tremendous impact on me. So I wanted to be able to inspire conversations and to really have them be critical. There just wasn't space for that. So to make a very long story short, I started to move out of the classroom and to try different vantage points of education to say, how could I get, you know, education to be liberatory, right? Is it curriculum? Is it policy? Is it research? Right? It's a little bit of all of those things, which is something that I've come to do, to understand. So if you enter the next phase of my life, you know, fast forward among a lot of things, you know, I have now recently come in contact with Takiema Bunche-Smith, who founded something called Woke Kindergarten. And I know that you all are middle and high school teachers, but I highly recommend you check out their Facebook, their YouTube, Instagram, etc. And this is a quick 60-second text that they do, that they've created around a lot of different concepts that had I had this when I was teaching, it might have inspired me to actually stay in the classroom. So a 60-second text, let's see what it says. Oops, it didn't play. So if it doesn't play, which is fine, you can go into, we can just go to the next one. It's
Spot
fine.
the difference.
Oh, there
By
we go.
Key, Woke Kindergarten. Can you spot the difference?
So I don't want to have tech.
Can you spot the difference?
So let's just pause the video and I'll just tell you.
Can you spot the difference?
That's okay. So don't play the video. And so I just want to describe to you, if you go to wokekindergarten.org and you just Google, you'll find all of it. And I would really recommend people look at this video because it's something that's not just for kindergarten. It's for adults, high school students, anyone that wants to have a critical conversation, right? And so this is looking at images of different types of protests, different types of activism, and also this idea of what are the responses, the state-sponsored responses, and also social responses that happen when people in different communities express their rights or also do illegal things, right, as of January 6th. And so it's actually made for younger children. But if you take a look at it, it can really engender a lot of conversation. Well, kindergarten and things like consortium school approaches is something that would have really shifted my understanding of what I could do in a classroom had they existed and had I known about them at that time. So I want to share that with you as a resource if you're not already aware. So like many people, going into parenthood changes your identity if you allow it to. And so those of you who, I'm sure, I can't see the chat right now, but some of you might know who this person is because you teach him. My son, Naeem, is a 10th grader at Humanities Prep Academy. And he and his educational experience was the entrance for me really into parent activism in the current form that I participate in it, right? So he was lucky to have experienced progressive education from preschool through about 5th grade, a little bit to a lesser degree for 6th through 8th grade. And then in 9th grade, he enters prep, right? Which was an intentional decision that we made as a family as we looked through that god-awful process of, you know, high schools. We struggle because he's musical, so we weren't sure if we wanted to do a music-focused program or a consortium type program, but honestly, we went to prep and it was just like hands down, we knew this was the place for us. So I want you to understand that my child in 9th grade, something shifted for him in terms of his connection to education and teachers and learning and himself. In his 9th grade class, he had more Black teachers and more teachers of color than his entire K to 8th grade experience combined in his first year. He also, for the first time, experienced being in a majority, right? So being in a majority student of color environment. He also got to experience students from different class backgrounds, which are much more the norm of New York City public schools than the schools that he's been in District 15. And also having multi-language learners and having more students with differing abilities, different students with housing situations, just a diversity that was reflective of New York. It really changed how he was in life and how he engaged in his education. It actually gave me a lot of questions, actually, that I still kind of think about. So here's prep, like the quality of his experience in a consortium school has literally been unmatched. And so it's been very interesting for me, right, knowing that from 3rd to 8th grade, I participated in the opt-out movement. If you go to the next slide, I think there might be an image of that. We're not going to show a video, but you know, when he got into 3rd grade and I started to understand that these high stakes tests were a thing, right? Because I did testing when I was little. It wasn't high stakes and it actually was assessment. And there were still issues with it, as there are, which you will hear more about in a little bit. The issue is that I just found, I was like, these tests are racist. They don't give teachers what they need to know. And I'm not going to participate in this. I feel like it's a civil rights issue. We're not going to do it. So that has been a lot of my life as a parent, of just coming to better understand like what I have to unlearn, right? So if you go 2 slides over, and I'm going to probably not be able to go through all of them because I want to make sure you have time to hear from the panelists. Yeah. So I feel like as an adult and in my career and as a parent, I've spent so much time kind of re-socializing myself to identify and unlearn what I learned in school, right? Whiteness, white supremacy, internalize and externalize anti-Blackness, bringing visibility to people and identities that have not been visible, LGBTQIA folks, non-binary folks, multi-language learners, people with disabilities. They're just like non-existent in so much of my educational experience. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, what if we could actually raise children that don't have to spend their adulthood re-socializing themselves around what they thought they knew to be true in school? What if we had the chance to create students that were able to think critically and to ask questions of history and to criticize and to back it up and to experiment and take different perspectives, and always to think about who is not in this room, who is not in this book, whose story is not being told, and from what perspective, who holds the power? If we were able to do that the way I know the possibility and the reality is there for consortium schools, we would have a completely different world that we live in, right? And that's my hope. So today your panelists are going to share a lot of ideas about this. And so if you go to the next slide, I think we're moving through, you're going to hear about history, you're going to hear about policy, you're going to hear about curriculum and activism, and most critically, you're going to hear about the lived experiences of someone who went through a consortium school and is now a parent. What an amazing gift we have to be able to hear from that perspective. And so this last thing is just about some of the work that like how I've been thinking about intersectionality. And so as you listen to folks, I want you to hold 2 things. There is a lot of work to be done, right? We're always going to have to be excavating and figuring out, what do we not know? What do we know that needs to be adjusted? How can we translate that work into what we do with children and families, right? And when we set policies and when we lead. The reality is all work is self-work. Self-work is daily work, as my dear friend Nikolai Pizarro talks about often. But for me, I would like you to, if you're open, to think about 2 things as you listen to the panelists. Intersectionality, right? Intersecting identities, the intersections of power, privilege, and oppression, right? As you listen to what people are going to talk about, and think about anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, which is truly at the root and the foundation of so much of our educational system. And we have not spent time systemically and also within teacher education and professional development to really unpack what that is. Yet we live in systems that actually show us the results of anti-Blackness, right? And so when you look at any statistic, you will see what I'm talking about in statistics regarding Black children. So I'm going to ask us to hold those two things as we move forward and listen to our amazing panelists. And we're going to begin with Stan Karp, who is the director of the Secondary Reform Project of the Education Law Center. He's an editor of Rethinking Schools and a 30-year veteran English and journalism teacher in Paterson, New Jersey. So Stan, hi, I see you on the screen.
Thanks, Takiema. Thank you so much. Let's see, I'm going to try to share a few slides too. Let's see if I can have something work. Thanks to all the tech people for resolving that. Can you see and hear me okay? I'm going to assume yes. Takiema, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. I can see you and your slides. Thank you, Stan.
Great, thanks. Today I was asked to share a brief overview of the history of standardized testing and the policy framework that has been built upon it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this history, and hopefully you're sharing it with your colleagues and your students. Moving ahead of here a little too fast. Let me get back, sorry. Because tracing the history of standardized testing is one very useful way to understand where all these tests came from and to push back against their misuse and their overuse. I'm going to share just a few slides. I also have my email there, stan.karp@gmail.com, if you want any of the slides or you want to follow up on anything I say. As many of you know, the origins of standardized testing trace back to racialized theories of intelligence and attempts to measure it. In the early 1900s, Professor Lewis Terman, a Stanford professor and a strong believer in eugenics, helped develop the IQ test and also the Army Alpha test, which was used to sort and label recruits during the massive mobilization for World War I. These tests were literally used to decide who went to officers' school and who went to fight in the infantry trenches. After World War I, the use of standardized testing expanded dramatically in schools. In the 1920s, Carl Brigham from Princeton University famously developed the SAT test to identify what he then called defective strains in the population. Around the same time, the arrival of large numbers of immigrant students in big city high schools led to tracking and ability grouping policies that were facilitated by standardized testing. These early tests were really not so much about assessing learning or intelligence, whatever that might mean. They were about disguising race and class privilege as merit. They were straight up tools of white supremacy, and in many ways, they still are. More recently, standardized testing has been the basis and the engine of a kind of education reform, often called test and punish reform, for the way the results of these exams have been used. Here are some landmarks in the history of test and punish reform. A Nation at Risk was a Reagan-era federal report that gave rise to the movement for state standards, which in turn fed the growth of state testing. NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, often called the nation's report card, is the longest running data set of test performance by US students. In the 1980s, the proficiency levels were deliberately set so unrealistically high on the NAEP tests that no real schools have ever met them. Even in the best performing states, which are typically Massachusetts and New Jersey, about half the kids fail to score proficient. As many of you know, the cut scores or passing scores on a standardized test can produce any result that the test designers desire. And while NAEP does have some useful features, its proficiency levels were designed to produce a narrative of failure. No Child Left Behind was passed in 2002, and it dramatically changed the focus of federal education policy. Federal policy moved away from a historic role in promoting access and equity through support for things like school integration, extra funding for high poverty schools, and services for students with special needs, to a ramped up version of test and punish. NCLB was using test score gaps to label schools as failures without providing the resources or the strategies to close the gaps. Instead, it punished schools and the people in them for the inequality that was reflected in the test scores. Race to the Top doubled down on NCLB, which we should remember was a bipartisan project of both major political parties. And Race to the Top promoted test-based teacher evaluation while using test scores to close schools, primarily in Black and brown communities, and to expand charter privatization. Between 2002 and 2012, over 4,000 public schools were closed, while the number of privatized charters doubled. Common Core came along in 2009, around the same time, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into two new testing consortia, PARC and SBAC. These new Common Core tests were based on the idea that because millions of students were not passing existing tests, the solution was to give harder ones. This was another wrong answer. NCLB required annual testing in grades 3 to 8 and again in high school. Before that, many states, including my own in New Jersey, would use grade span testing once in elementary school, once in middle school, once in high school. But after NCLB was passed, the number of states testing yearly rose from 19 to all 50. By 2015, the average urban student took 112 tests from their pre-K through 12th grade careers. 16 states had test-based promotion policies. 27 states had testing for high school diplomas. 43 used test-based teacher evaluation. The effects of this massive misuse and overuse of standardized testing were predictable, and they were known in advance to social scientists. Activists and researchers both became familiar with a maxim developed by social scientist Donald Campbell in 1976 that became known as Campbell's Law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more apt it is subject to corruption pressures, and the more apt it is to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And frankly, the same obsession with quantifying learning is now playing out again and around the idea of learning loss. Even though measuring the gaps in opportunity and resources reflected in standardized test scores has never translated into the kind of equitable and adequate school funding needed to address the inequality that exists all around us. In fact, at this point, testing kids for learning loss in the middle of a COVID pandemic is a little bit like passing out thermometers in the middle of a malaria outbreak. So this is what we've gotten from decades of standardized testing. We've gotten a narrative of public education failure. We've seen decisions moved away from schools and educators to politicians and bureaucrats. We've seen narrowed curriculum, degraded instruction. We've seen an expansion of the school to prison pipeline. One study showed that rigorous high school exit testing can boost incarceration rates by as much as 12%. We've seen periodic cheating scandals. In the decade after NCLB was passed, there were over 200 school districts that saw cheating scandals. Fair Test has identified 65 different ways schools have sometimes cheated to boost test scores, from cooking the testing pool to falsifying answer sheets. Test scores have also been used to close schools, promote charters, mayoral and state takeovers, and private management. The good news is these policies have also created a massive grassroots opposition movement led by parents, educators, and students. And in recent years, this resistance and activism has changed policy and won some real victories. The opt-out movement led by parents and joined by hundreds of thousands of students and teachers who simply refused to take or administer the tests. This activism helped roll back high school exit testing in 27 states to about 11 today. We saw a decline of PARC and SBAC. PARC is gone and SBAC is greatly reduced. We've seen a fiscal and credibility crisis of test publishers fed by scoring errors, business losses, and corruption stories. We've had a fantastic growth of test-free college admissions, More than 2/3 of all four-year colleges now make available test optional admissions. That's more than 1,500 colleges and universities. In 2018, the Red for Ed wave of teacher walkouts changed the national conversation about education from tests and charters to school funding and teacher salaries. It also culminated in the only popular thing that Betsy DeVos ever did, when last year, as the pandemic spread, all 50 states secured a waiver from ESSA testing mandates for 2020. In fact, the educational irrelevance of these tests and their existence as an obstacle to serving the real needs of students was one of the first lessons of the pandemic. This activism and advocacy has opened up an opportunity to roll back the damage standardized testing has done and to move in another direction. Here's a headline from Valerie Strauss's answer sheet column in the Washington Post from last June that reflects a sharp decline in the public support for the policies of test and punish, evidence which we also saw during the campaign, at least in many changed positions on the part of the Democratic candidates. But while we've won some important victories, the campaign to end the misuse and overuse of standardized testing is far from over. Right now, some states like New York are asking for a renewal of the federal testing waiver, while others, like my own state of New Jersey, are making insane plans to test kids in the middle of a pandemic, even if it means tracking and testing kids remotely in their own homes. It's a reminder that to defeat test and punish policies, we not only need to end high-stakes standardized testing, we need to develop alternatives, and not just alternative assessments, as important as those are. We need alternative models of education that put children and justice at the center. And that's why the work of the consortium, which is not only about alternative models of assessment, but about alternative models of education, remains so important, and why I'm really happy to be with you today. I'm going to stop there.
Ooh, unable to start video. I can't open my video up. It says my video is muted.
Oh, wait a second.
That's okay.
Did that help? I stopped the share.
Okay, yeah, no, great, thank you. Thank you, Stan. I was able to go over to the YouTube and look at the chat, and people have lots of reactions to what you're talking about. And I think that, I know we're short on time, but this definitely shouldn't be the end of a conversation. You know, when you hear it all together, you really do start to wonder what's going on here. And I really like that you ended with this idea of justice and children at the center, right? Because who is this serving? These tests, right? Lots of questions for us. And so we're gonna move on to Taina Camacho, who has so many letters behind her name. I can't even say them all, but I think she has quite a few degrees. She's a substance abuse counselor, New Directions Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Treatment Program. And she's a consortium graduate and a parent of a consortium student. We're so excited to hear some thoughts from you, Taina, and be in conversation in a little bit. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for being here, of course. I could definitely go on a rant about how a consortium school, Urban Academy, saved my life and has shaped me to be the person I am today. So I'll start with, you know, I started out at a traditional school, elementary, high school. And although I did do well, it was at some point where I just started falling through the cracks and I couldn't stay engaged with the curriculum. I didn't want to keep taking the tests. And quickly I would just, it became me just going into school, taking attendance and sneaking out a side door. Within a few months though, I knew I had to do something because I didn't want to just be a dropout. Eventually I wanted to do something with my life. So I did a search for something alternative and I came up with Urban Academy. And it was during my first encounter at a half-day visit at Urban Academy that I fell in love with the type of education that a consortium school can provide. I had sat in on a class when there was so much happening, but here I saw students engaged. I didn't see the side conversations happening that I would at my other high school. And there was something magical happening. There were conversation, like teacher to student. It wasn't just a lecture. It wasn't just paper. It felt alive. And it was just fascinating to see. And after that visit, there was an interview of sorts. And I told them if they didn't accept me, I was just going to drop out until I turned 16 and get my GED, because obviously there was nowhere else that I could even attempt to go to school if it wasn't there. So throughout the rest of my high school experience, well, needless to say, I was accepted. So throughout my experience there, I was taught more than anything how to be a critical thinker, to analyze, question, test, experiment, all these wonderful things that I didn't see at a different school. And like some of the examples I can give was specifically one I remember where we covered the American Revolution. And I remember thinking, oh, the American Revolution, like how many more times can you learn that in school, right? But here was different. Here we were learning the American Revolution from different perspectives. We actually got to see articles from England, or it was like a textbook from England detailing the American Revolution. And it was mind-blowing for me to see a different narrative, especially one in which America was the bad guy. So it's, up until this point, my world was pretty small. Like my world was a 5-block radius from my home, and I barely traveled around Manhattan. And teaching to the standardized test meant a very specific narrative was taught. I believe it was experiences like this that not only helped develop my ability as a thinker, but also as a human. I was able to see more than one viewpoint. And I think that not only empowered my cognitive development, my social development, my psychological development, it helped to create a more empathic person. I would say the consortium also provided me with advocacy skills, right? Whether it was going to Albany for a protest, or advocating for myself when I was told that a certain philosophy course was more geared towards upperclassmen, so I might not be okay there. But being able to sit with a teacher and advocate for myself and my ability, and then being allowed to take the course and not only passing, but doing really well. Granted, it was the most challenging reading I've ever had, and I spent hours dissecting like 5 pages, but I would get high marks, and the quality of my work was praised and my intelligence validated in a way that I didn't get anywhere else. With traditional schools and standardized testing, it's like this level we're all supposed to like be at, right? You're taught this, you do it or you don't. Whereas I think with consortium education, it's very much meeting the student where they're at. It's not a textbook education, it's a life education. And I think that education also helped to create who I am today as a therapist, right? One of the biggest mantras we have in therapy is meet the client where they're at. And I think that's exactly what a consortium education does, is meet the student where they're at, where it's like, okay, if this is an area where you struggle with, let's work on that. Let's harness that power. Let's fine tune those skills. Scaffolding, right? And the things that I did well, we're going to push you even harder. We're going to challenge your thoughts. We're going to really help you to prosper, and grow and develop in so many ways. And I think that this is what our youth needs now more than ever, right? to be seen, heard, nurtured, and provided with this holistic education, not just a test. Go ahead.
What a wonderful testimony. It's perfect.
Thank you.
Just like, I'm sitting here just like, I know everyone, I think some of your teachers or people who know you are on the YouTube chat, and it's so beautiful to see you draw that line between advocating for yourself to get into, right? And Michelle Fine is on this. I know when I studied with Michelle Fine, I remembered framing dropout. She said that students who she researched and found out that students who chose to drop out were like way smarter and self-advocates and just really like, this system is trash, like making those choices. And you made that choice to say, listen, I'm going to be in a place that is going to see me and all of my humanity. And what you got out of it and what you're giving to the world right now in your work is incredible. And I know you also have a child that's in a consortium school. So how is that working out? You can briefly share.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I've actually reflected in the last like couple months about the difference in my experience and her experience as a person. You know, I do think, you know, it's very clear that education she's getting is different and what she's learned is different. You know, she is at her age or going into high school, I was interested in all the wrong things, where she is all about being aware and political. She understands politics. She's all for gender rights and the Black Lives Matter movement. She's so woke, right? I was busy with boys, unfortunately, right? So it wasn't until urban that it was just like, whoa, light bulb. And that's the thing about, I don't even know if it's seen to that scale, but it was a generational shift, generational education. Because through my experience, I helped raise a human being in a much better way than if I had stood in my neighborhood in a regular school.
That is so powerful, because when we are doing the work towards liberation, it is so difficult to see that there's any change actually happening, right? Like teachers and leaders, you're like in the drudge of just right policymakers. Everything feels like it's never going to get better. And so to have you standing in front of us as an example of someone whose life was profoundly changed by this educational approach, and then in one generation, you have been able to, you know, do a little bit about what I mentioned, like re-socialize your child so that she questions the narrative that is just out there. Like, that's beautiful. I'm so like,
thank you.
I feel really honored to have heard your story.
Yeah, at the end of your statement, I was like, that's exactly what you know, Urban and the consortium did for me and what I've been doing for my daughter. So it didn't have to happen in college. Like, it's been happening her whole life. It's amazing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to now introduce Jessie Hagopian, who is a history and ethnic studies teacher and co-advisor to the Black Student Union at Garfield High School in Seattle, Washington, which is the site of the historic boycott of the MAP test in 2013. And I know Jessie's done a lot of other things as well. And so we're excited to hear from you, Jessie, and just shouting out your shirt, Black Lives Matter at School Week, first day of Black History Month. There's a lot happening, snowstorm over here. Take it away.
Right on. Thank you so much, Takiema. Thank you for your brilliant chapter in our book, Black Lives Matter at School. And I hope everybody reads that. Thanks to the Consortium School. Happy Black Lives Matter at School Week, everybody. I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Duwamish people and the Coast Salish people. And I am so happy to be with the Consortium School because I have a special place in my heart for the work that all of these educators and students and parents are doing in this network, because I first became aware of the consortium schools really out of a desire for self-preservation. As was mentioned, I helped to organize a boycott of a high-stakes standardized test called the MAP test at my high school in 2013. And all the educators at my school voted unanimously to refuse to give this district mandated test. And the tested subject teachers were threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay. And we had to organize a national, even international campaign to keep our educators safe. And one of the most important parts of our campaign was being able to talk about what the alternative is to these mind-numbing rote memorization, drill and kill, high stakes tests. And it was coming in contact with the consortium schools that really helped me articulate what the vision could look like, and helped all the educators at Garfield High School explain the direction we wanted to move in and how powerful and what great outcomes we could have if we embraced holistic models of learning and assessment. And I'm proud to say that because of the campaign that we waged, not only were all of the teachers spared, not one of them was suspended or reprimanded, and also the MAP test was completely eliminated for all of Seattle's high schools at the end of that school year, in a just resounding victory for our movement. And many of our educators began traveling to visit the consortium schools to see what performance-based assessment could look like, so we could begin organizing that alternative. And the alternative is so desperately needed because so many corporate education reformers just love high stakes standardized tests because it fits their narrow model for education being about competition. And this was really driven home for me when my son started kindergarten a few years back. And he was starting at a school that was becoming an international school, and it was bringing in language immersion of Spanish and Mandarin. And so they were renaming it an international school, and they had a big ribbon cutting ceremony at my son's school to celebrate this new chapter in the school. And they had school board members there and many different community leaders. And then the governor's education aide was there, and all the kids were out on the front lawn of the school listening to speeches from these politicians. And the governor's education aide took the podium and said, "I want to thank all you students for making the choice to come to this school, because now you will be prepared to compete in the global economy." Cheers did not erupt from the third grade section. That was not the winning line, right? And I was just sitting there like, I did not send my son to this school so he could learn Spanish so that he could outcompete somebody else's kid for a job. I wanted him to learn Spanish so he could better communicate with more people in the world and understand other people's humanity, right? Unfortunately, that is the business model of education that we have to struggle against. And so much of schooling in America is about competition. It's about shame, and it's about fear. And it's especially about instilling shame and fear in Black children and in BIPOC youth. And, they tell us that school is important, and if you don't do your homework, you can't get a good job. And they say, study hard and you can get ahead. And then they hold up the test scores as the great arbiter of who has worked hard and who is worthy of status and who is worthy of college and a good job and healthcare and everything that comes with that. And then they say, look at the achievement gap, and Black people are perpetually behind white students, they say. And what else but shame are our Black kids supposed to feel? But in fact, when you listen to what Stan delivered early on, you know that Carl Brigham, who developed the SAT exam, did it, he said, quote, to show the defective strains in the population, right? And as Stan said, these tests have been disguising race and class, and I would say gender privilege, as merit for a long time. And they want us to use education in this way to shame Black children into believing that they deserve their lot in life because they didn't achieve or they didn't score well on the test. And I would submit to you all today that we need to stop using this term, the achievement gap, right? We need to instead understand that there's an education debt. And we need to know that Black Lives Matter at school is coming to collect on that debt, right? This is an uprising across the country that is saying we will not be defined by these narrow test scores, and that real education reform is about transforming the conditions of teaching and learning. It's about creating community schools that have wraparound services that support all of our youth, and especially our Black youth who have been funneled into a school to prison pipeline in this nation through zero tolerance discipline policies that are disproportionately targeting Black students and students of color. And I think when we change the metric, when we change the way we assess students, all of a sudden we can see the brilliance of our Black students. Because I've taught at Garfield High School the advanced placement classes, the general ed classes, and I recently started teaching an ethnic studies course. And for the first time, I had an integrated class, because usually my AP classes were mostly white kids and my general ed classes were mostly Black and brown students. But my ethnic studies course was racially diverse. And what I found was that when I began class by letting the students know that they would not be taking a single multiple choice test for the entire year, that created some anxiety for white students who had scored very well on these tests. And when I changed what I was looking to assess from the ability to eliminate wrong answer choices to instead the ability to identify a problem in our society and develop collective solutions to address that problem. In fact, my Black students were off the charts in terms of their ability to develop arguments against institutional racism and identify ways to collectively struggle against it. And my white students had to sit back and learn quite a bit. And in fact, I think we need to see that our Black students are not at a deficit when we change the goal of education. Instead of being able to eliminate wrong answer choices at a faster rate, to identifying problems and fixing them, that our Black children will thrive. And I think that's part of the success of the consortium schools in meeting the needs of students of color. I want to just say that in order for this movement to truly transform education, I hope that everyone will embrace the Black Lives Matter at School movement. It starts today, and it's all week is our week of action, but we've developed a year of purpose framework so that every month there's a day of action and there are reflection questions for educators to ask themselves in defense of our Black students. And I just want to end today by quoting one of my heroes, Septima Clark, who said, "I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm." Thank you all for having me today.
Thank you so much, Jesse. You said a whole lot of words right now, and I'm just so sorry that we don't have time for a full-on Q&A. I just want to lift up, you mentioned education debt, and Gloria Latson-Billings actually coined that term. And, you know, if you don't know her, you should know her. She's no longer, she's a professor emeritus, I believe, but she coined and sort of identified culturally relevant teaching, which is a book that changed my life when I was an assistant teacher doing my master's in education. I was like, oh, I get it. I get it. And so I think
crediting her.
Yeah, for sure. I think she did a speech for AERA, the American Educational Research Network, which is where it kind of came through. But really, the idea is that we have been locating the source of quote unquote failure of Black children in particular, but we can look at children of all marginalized identities, right? The failure for them to be on par with, or right, be equal educationally, and in other cases, we have located the source of that within them and their communities. And that is not why they're not achieving. It is systemic racism, it's classism, it's homophobia, heterosexism. It is all these things, right? The systems, and systems are made up of people. So we all participate in these systems and these behaviors and this oppression unless we actively work against it. So that goes true for teachers, for everybody, right? This is the society we live in. So let's look at the debt that is owed to people who have been marginalized, as opposed to saying, let's give them more test prep. Let's give them Saturday school. Like, I don't want that. Go play in the snow on Saturday, okay? So I think it's important for us to really think about that. And also, for the Black Lives Matter at School Week has been extremely powerful for me. And when I entered into the space 2 years ago, I wanted to make sure that we included early childhood, because everything you see in 6th grade and up, everything you see in kindergarten has its roots and has begun from the time people are inside the womb, to be quite frank, right? We don't even make it out of the womb at the same rates, right? Black children die and Black mothers die during pregnancy and childbirth. So the early childhood piece is something that I've brought, and I will share the link in the chat. We have for our offering this week, and we have many coming up actually, is the Early Childhood Black Lives Matter at School Symposium. We center Black joy, and we want to figure out how to support Black children to thrive. And so I'll put the link in the chat. Right now we have 2,500 people registered, so you might want to go quickly because it's going to cap at 2,900. But thank you to Jesse for your leadership in this, because this has become a movement, and we know it was never about a week, right? And it's always been about every single day. And it just has inspired a movement and inspired action for people, which it can't go back now. And I love how 2020 came about, right? May came about, and everyone was like, wait a minute, somebody's doing something that focuses on Black people and children in school? Like, wow, let's find out about that. And it's like, Jesse, it's 2016. It's been your whole life you've been doing it, but here we are. Let's jump on and move it forward. And so just, we have to end, and you have to go to your workshops. There's never enough time. We will never have closure. If you have closure, you should be concerned, because it means you're not going to continue learning and being inspired. So, so the work continues. I think we're going to share our emails and all the links and things that we've referenced today with folks in a follow-up email. I believe the YouTube, if technology acts right, will be available for folks to look at again after. And just a reminder of the invitation that I brought in the beginning, to think about an intersectional lens in the work that you do, and to think about your own identities and how they impact your work with children and families, and to think about anti-Blackness and how we can root it out, right? And this is how, one way that we will get to a more just educational and democratic experience, on top of the work that you're already doing by being in a consortium school. I think y'all are the bomb, and I'm old, so I can use that term. I know it's not what the millennials say, but I love consortium schools and speak so highly of you, and I'm super, super grateful for everything that you have sacrificed this year, but just your commitment to doing this work for children and families. Thank you so much. So I think we're gonna be able to move on to the workshops. And so is Anne gonna jump on to just let people know what to do next?
Anne, you're muted.
Anne, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Takiema, for that really excellent panel. And thank you to the panelists. You gave us a lot to think about. I want to call out Jesse for finally calling achievement gap as a negative, which is really an important idea. One proactive note before you all disappear. Miguel Cardona, who is Biden's Secretary of Education, has not yet issued a decision about whether to issue a waiver from federal testing requirements that are under ESSA. And officials from many states, including our Board of Regents, they've urged Cardona to do that. You can support this effort by signing a petition, which is posted online.